Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this month's Dunstan Thomas webinar. We've still got quite a few people arriving as we speak, so I'll kind of waffle on for a few minutes and give latecomers who've obviously got meetings running on. It is that time of day in the world of Zoom and Teams where you all start to run a few minutes behind. So the topic of this session is intergenerational wealth transfer. I always feel like I've got false teeth when I fall over that one, so I'll try not to say it too many times. But we've got some great speakers lined up. It's mainly a Q&A session, but we've asked each of our speakers to do a little kind of 5-minute background as to why they're particularly interested in this subject at the moment. I guess the first question is why Dunstan Thomas? Before I do the intros, why are we interested in this? Well, you know, we've got a long legacy in providing technology into the pensions and wealth space, and clearly a lot of our customers are using that technology for their wealth propositions, right the way up to into and through retirement, and more we're seeing that kind of retirement space. That wealth held in the hands of the older generations has been absolutely key to the kind of long-term viability of wealth planning businesses. And typically, people's pensions assets are pretty much at the top of the pile in terms of the real value of that asset compared to the rest of their wealth. So obviously, property, as we know, is a huge one, but behind that, typically their pension funds are the things that are representing the majority of somebody's wealth at that period in time. So the three people we've got with us today, a couple of familiar faces for those of you who come onto our webinars regularly. We've got Jessica List, who's Pensions Technical Manager at Curtis Banks, our new parent company. Thanks for coming, Jessica. Jessica's been with Curtis Banks for 9 years. She's worked in the SIP support team, helping clients and advisors with general queries, and product technical team, working on products and delivering legislative changes and staff training. So quite a technician, and obviously pensions really important, as we kind of just outlined. And I'll let Jessica kind of introduce herself and a little bit about her interest in this particular topic in a second. And then we've got Daniel Bland. Daniel works with EQ Investors. Congratulations, Dan. I was at the dinner on Tuesday night, the Platform Awards, where you guys picked up two gongs. So well done on that. I'm sure there were a few hangovers in the EQ world next morning.
Lots of pots of coffee on the desks. Yeah,
very good. Well done on that one. So Dan joined EQ Investors from Quilter Cheviot, where he managed their private client portfolios and developed an experience and has been a specialist fixed interest in equity mandates. Daniel began his career in financial services at RBS after graduating from University of Nottingham. Subsequently joining the investment team at Best Invest. I've got a pension at Best Invest, actually, and over 7 years experience as an investment manager. He's got a master's in wealth management. Not sure, certainly beyond my level of qualification. I don't know what anybody else on the screen, so well done on that. From the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment, and a personal charter as a fellow of the same institute. So welcome, Daniel. And then Tim, new to the Dunstan Thomas webinar arena. Thanks for coming. I understand we've got you out of your sick bed as well.
Yes, afraid so, but I'm pumped full of drugs, so I'll be all right.
Good. So a special thanks for coming along on the back of not being feeling very well. Tim's Chief Technology Officer at Progeny. After setting up a financial marketing consultancy in 24, Tim and his team joined their biggest client. So a bit like we did with Curtis Banks. They were one of our biggest customers. Tim and the guys joined Progeny. He was their in-house marketing development manager from November 19, and then marketing director, and then soon after returned to your technology roots. There's a technologist in all of us. So Tim's now responsible for that whole way that Progeny faced the market from a technology perspective. So you'll probably see that what we've got here is some interesting touch points between the speakers. We've obviously got that need to talk about pensions as an asset, inheritance, and wealth in retirement. Then we've got that kind of intergenerational difference and nuances in terms of ESG investing that Daniel's going to touch on, and then the important thing, how do we face off to clients who span multi-generations from a technology perspective. And I think if anything, this whole kind of pandemic thing has got us all thinking about how best to engage with customers, particularly through technology at this time. So that's kind of my, I was looking at some figures earlier on. The forecasts from a lot of research think tanks are something like 624,000 high net worth clients will transfer something like 1.9 trillion of assets over the next 10 years. The figures are eye-watering. So I think for every wealth business, at every intermediated business, it has to be a market that everybody's paying particular attention to in terms of how we best propositionally represent our companies to that market. Okay, Jessica, I'm going to hand over to you just for a few minutes to talk through some of your views and that of Curtis Banks within this space.
Thank you. So, as you said, pensions are often one of a person's biggest assets, and pensions, I think particularly defined contribution pensions, do now play a huge part in this intergenerational wealth transfer planning and opportunities. With the pension freedoms rules now, it's very easy to plan and spread benefits very tax efficiently between a much wider pool of beneficiaries than would have been possible sort of before 2015. So I think we're already in a space where actually it's quite common for advisors and clients to look at other sources of savings and possible retirement income sources first, and where possible, leave DC pensions intact to take advantage of that planning piece around the intergenerational wealth transfer. I think it's too soon to see whether that trend will, I suppose, increase in the future as DC pensions become more prevalent, or whether actually, because they'll become more prevalent because there are fewer DB pensions about, whether actually it will be a case that more people actually need to use those DC pensions for their own pension income, and don't have the DB as potentially one of those sources of income that they can look at instead. So, I mean, this is all assuming that the rules stay the same long enough to notice trends as these things change, which is always a dangerous thing to predict in pensions. But at the moment, as things stand, DC pensions right up there as a big area for this intergenerational wealth piece. That said, I think there are a few important areas to consider, or a few important issues to consider if you're thinking about a DC pension purely in terms of its wealth transfer potential rather than its retirement income potential. The first one, probably won't be any surprise that this is the first one I'll mention, is that you have to get the expression of wishes right, and you do have to be in the pension scheme that can support what you're looking to do. So unfortunately, as much flexibility as there is within this planning piece, there are pitfalls to avoid, both in the legislation itself, so it's ever-ending headache of when beneficiaries drawdown is actually available. But there's also pitfalls to watch out for in providers' restrictions as well. For instance, you might find that a provider can't open the beneficiary plan if the beneficiary lives overseas, or perhaps if they're over 75, something like that. These are the types of things that providers may have put in place for their normal clients, as it were, but then either due to choice or through to a system restriction or something like that, they can also pass on to beneficiary plans. So if you are looking at this planning piece, you've got to make sure that the rules and the provider that you're with can support the plan that's being put in place. So I think the second thing that I'd raise as a consideration is inheritance tax. So we know that pensions will normally be outside of the scope for IHT, but there could still be some considerations there. A key example is the Staveley case that was finally resolved last year. That was the one that was looking at someone who transferred knowing that they were in ill health and then passed away within 2 years, which is when HMRC might have a look at it to see whether they think that it has created a transfer of value for IHT purposes. Now, the Staveley case did eventually get a positive outcome, but it was very contentious. the decisions changed at pretty much every stage of the ruling. And even at that Supreme Court stage at the end, it wasn't unanimous. It was by majority. So even at that final stages, there were different opinions about whether or how the rule should be applied. So I think it's very far from clear cut, and it's still too soon for us to have had more subsequent cases coming through to see which, if any, of those principles might apply to future cases. So if you are in a situation that could be vaguely similar, it is definitely still worth thinking about whether there could be that potential IHT consideration. So I think the final thing that I wanted to raise in this sort of intro in this area is just around the potential for death benefits rules or inheritance tax rules to change. So I think it's one thing if people are looking at their different sources of savings now and are saying, actually, as the rules stand, it makes sense to look at other sources of income first and to keep that DC pension intact for the intergenerational wealth potential. I think it's probably also completely fair if people are still funding their savings and they're looking at how to make use of their different tax allowances. And one of the considerations with, say, funding up to the annual allowance is that those funds do have that potential IHT, intergenerational wealth planning, death benefits, advantageous environment should something happen. But what we do also sometimes see now is where people are thinking of that pension or thinking of funding pension purely for the IHT potential, particularly among over 75s where the lifetime allowance isn't a consideration anymore. And for personal and third party contributions, at least, the annual allowance isn't a consideration anymore. I think if you're in that sort of territory where people are thinking of putting, say, potentially large amounts in purely for IHT planning purposes, that's possibly where things get a little bit stickier. I think firstly, from the point of view, if you might find that providers aren't necessarily willing to facilitate that because of the risk of it potentially being seen as avoidance. But also, that's not primarily what a pension is for. So if the rules do change, chances are the pension rules are always going to support pension being tax efficient for saving for your pension income, but the death benefits rules is sort of less of a certain area. I definitely don't think it's out of the question for death benefits rules to change. There's already plenty of discussion about whether the rules now are overly generous and whether they would be easy pickings for sort of further rule tinkering. And I think it's also fair to say that over the last maybe year, 18 months, there has been a lot more discussion about this intergenerational wealth transfer planning, these opportunities, and about the fairness of the current systems. For example, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development released a study earlier this year looking at inheritance taxation systems, again concluding that there could be a lot of work to do if we want to make systems that encourage wealth to be dispersed amongst a greater pool of people. And the Institute for Fiscal Studies has done a few reports this year looking at inheritance and inequality, looking at why wealthy parents end up having or raising wealthy children or people who go on to be wealthy. Some of that can be accounted for from sort of the opportunities that wealthy parents can provide for wealthy children, but a lot of it is those direct wealth transfers where cash is continuing to stay sort of from wealth and going to wealth. So this is something that's being discussed more and more. And I think if we do end up in a place where the IHT rules change to encourage people to disperse wealth amongst a wider pool of potentially less well-off recipients, or perhaps recipients who aren't expecting to receive other large inheritances as well, the death benefits rules for DC pensions could end up sticking out a bit as the one thing left, as it were, that allows you to pass it perhaps to your already wealthy spouse or already wealthy child without being encouraged to do something else. So it could be that if we do see changes in one area, they both sort of have to change so that things balance out or so that the whole system works. So I suppose DC pensions do play a big part in this wealth transfer discussion. And of course, there is a lot of planning opportunity there. But I think it's just always worth remembering that pensions are first and foremost for the retirement income. And it's just finding that balance between planning around the rules as they were, but keeping an eye on these kinds of discussions and what things might change going forward as well.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jessica. We'll come back to questions attendees a little bit later on. One thing I did forget to say, and I've put in the chat as part of my intro, the way we're doing the question thing is if you click on the Ask the Question link at the bottom, you can then add your question. You can also see the questions that are coming up, and you're able to vote them up as well. So if and there's a chance we won't get to all the questions later on, so it might be worth, if there's a question that you haven't asked yourself that you do want answered, if you vote that up, that'd be really useful, so we get to prioritise them as we go through. Excellent. So Dan, over to you to tell us a little bit why ESG in particular is important in this as an area of concern.
Thanks, and I think it'd be quite helpful just to I'd give a quick background on EQ to sort of frame where I'm coming at things from. So EQ Investors, we're a sustainable and impact investing specialist firm. We're a founding UK B Corporation in the UK, and really encourage anyone who hasn't heard of B Corporations to go and have a look at what that's all about. It's stakeholder capitalism and a different way of doing business. Our experience with sustainable and impact investing is that investors don't need to sacrifice returns in order to align their investments with their values, and that's borne out with our track record now stretches just over over 8 years now of impact investing. So that's very much where we're coming from, and with that in mind, I thought I'd look at the risks, opportunities, and perhaps some of our experience, or my experience, working with some of those next generation wealth holders and working with families to help sort of structure investments so it meets the next generation's needs. I think from a risk perspective, this handover of wealth to a next generation with a slightly different mindset and approach to investing and wealth in general, there's a risk to incumbent business models that are based on old relationships but long-standing relationships. But they typically might be within businesses that rely on those relationships and don't necessarily have the technology and the skill set to deal with the expectations of the next generation. So I think that there's definitely a risk to incumbent business models. But then clearly on the other side of that, there's a huge amount of opportunity. So if you can engage with investors with their values as well as their ambitions financially, you can really create much deeper relationships. And I think that goes for current generation as well as next generation wealth holders, but it's particularly important with next generation wealth holders. And it's also important in the context of the financial services industry. You know, what we do is becoming ever more commoditized. And in order to keep strong relationships and to maintain engagement with clients and investors, it's really important to pick up that values piece and start thinking about how you can align your investments with your values. What do the next generation actually want? So I find that I don't want to overplay this too much, but I think that a lot of the next generation have seen the financial crisis and have seen the fallout of that, both having a general mistrust of the financial services industry, but also understanding that some businesses operate in a way that their external costs end up being borne by the state. So businesses may ignore external costs, environment and society at the expense of probably the government and to individuals, and then actually a lot come from that mindset, and that frames some of the thinking around the values piece. But actually also it frames the need for greater levels of transparency. And when we're thinking about sustainable investing, and if you want to talk to the next generation about sustainable investing, you need evidence that what you're able to present in terms of an investment strategy or a wealth plan, there needs to be some evidence that supports the fact that it's aligned with their values. So you need a really high level of transparency, in order to foster that trust. And then I think from a technology perspective, and we've got someone touching on that later, but I suppose it's quite a neat segue actually, but it's really important. Not too much paper, If you've not got a seamless system that reports on your phone through a web app, you don't have all these reams of documents, which quite frankly are meaningless, won't get read. That's a straight away is an off-put for the next generation. So I guess to summarize, from our perspective, we see investors, the next gen investors, know that they don't need to sacrifice returns in order to align their investments to their values. In fact, a lot of them recognize that the future opportunity sets for lots of businesses exist in businesses solving environmental and social problems. We really need to look at decarbonisation as one example of that, and that you can use this as an opportunity to deepen relationships, and remember, the next gen will also be generating their own wealth as well. So you as a business can help grow and expand your investment base as well. I think you're on mute. That
schoolboy error. Tell them a bit how to practice on this. Apologies. Thank you, Daniel. We'll come back to questions specific to that a little bit later as well. And then Tim, again, thanks for coming to your first one of these. I'll hand over to you.
Nice one. Thank you, Andrew. So yeah, like Dan, I'll give a bit of background just to set the scene. So I'm Tim Thompson-Rye, Chief Technology Officer at Progeny. Progeny is a multidisciplinary advisory firm. So the biggest part of the business is financial planning, but we also offer private and corporate legal services, asset management, tax services, and also HR services for our business clients. So it's quite a mix. We're a medium-sized firm, about 210 people. We have grown from 12 people to 210 in the last 5 years, so really fast growth. As I say, biggest part of the business is financial planning. We've got about 3,000 client families and a total AUM approaching 2 billion. So clearly, intergenerational transfer of wealth is hugely important for us. Andrew, you threw out some numbers. The numbers I've seen is that £1 trillion worth of wealth is set to transfer in the next decade, 5.5 trillion in the next 30 years. So it's incredibly important for firms like us to be future-proofing our businesses so that they're ready for that next generation. And that's something we need to be working on right now. Otherwise, we're going to miss the boat on that. So a big part of my role as CTO is ensuring that our proposition and the way that we deliver it is fit for purpose today, but also that we're designing, developing, and changing it to meet the needs and the expectations of the clients of tomorrow, so that we're, as I say, ready to serve those clients for decades to come. And for me, that word expectations is the really key part of this discussion. Next gen clients, sort of similar to what Dan's been saying, next gen clients do have different expectations to, let's call them current gen clients. They're younger, they've been influenced by different factors. In many ways, it's dead obvious. If you look at the way that millennials consume information or interact with brands, it's generally very different to the way that older clients do. I do realize I'm generalizing massively, by the way, but you can't not in a discussion like this. So for me, there are 3 key differences in next gen clients' expectations. Firstly, their approach. Our chief marketing officer used a great analogy the other day, which I'm going to shamelessly steal. Boomers, so your kind of age 60 plus clients, roughly, they tend to want to hand over control. So this is all about hands. They want to hand over control. They want someone else to take their problem, sort it, go away, come back with a solution. Gen X, the kind of generation in the middle, are juggling. So everything's maybe a bit out of control. Maybe they're at the peak of their career. They've got children, mortgage, they're managing school fees, whatever else. Millennials, or the next generation of wealth, want to take control. They want to operate on their terms. They want structure. They want to understand what's happening at any given moment. But at the same time, they are more time poor than retirees, so it needs to be made really easy for them. The second way that their expectations might be different is the way they access information. While older clients might be happy with an annual review or quarterly statement, younger clients are used to instant access to everything. The way they get their news, social media, even things like Amazon Prime, where they can click a button and something arrives. They're used to getting things straight away, and it's actually quite jarring for them if they can't get stuff straight away. So if you look at something like online banking, they can tap an app on their phone, they can see their balance and their transactions. So why would they not expect the same thing from their financial advisor? I think the third thing in terms of expectations is communication. Millennials, again, they want it on their terms, whether that's the method in terms of virtual or face-to-face, the timing, they want it to be on demand. Things like live chat might be really important. They want to communicate in their own way. So when you couple those expectations with the fact that next-gen clients typically aren't profitable yet because they've not built up much wealth, and most advisors charge on a percentage of AUM, it makes it a challenging market to serve right now. So how do we design a profitable proposition to meet those clients' expectations? Clearly, given my role, I think it's all to do with technology. Technology can help us to deliver a proposition that's both profitable now and matches our future clients' expectations. But, and it might be a bit odd to hear a technology officer saying this, technology alone is not the solution. I think this is a major misconception about next-gen clients, that they want to act or interact only through technology. They just want an app, for example, and that's the only bit that matters to them. But I don't think that's true at all. If you look at, there's a great piece of research from Accenture called The New Face of Wealth Management, a few years old now, maybe some of you have seen it. What that shows is that, yes, as digital natives, they expect a technology offering as standard, but only 11% use a robo-advice solution, and 2/3 want some form of hybrid model. So that's what I see as the solution. It's that hybrid model that combines the best of technology with the best of traditional models, or the best of people, really. People are great at interaction, coaching, empathizing, and technology can't replace that, and in my view, nor should it try. But what we should be doing is letting the technology do what people are not so good at, so providing information instantly or working through monotonous, repetitive tasks. Now, of course, this is not a new concept. The term hybrid advice has been around for a good few years. Obviously, it certainly wasn't me that came up with it, but it hasn't yet had a huge impact on the market and the way that our industry is delivering its services, in my opinion. And at the moment, currently it's mostly the large investment houses that are pursuing this because they see the opportunity. And that's the key thing for me. It is a huge opportunity. Advisors who get this right now are going to be the first to the party. That's a huge competitive advantage. And if we get this right, we can create something that's going to be really quite unique and special, and maybe even start to close the huge advice gap that we have in this country. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks Tim. Quite a few questions started to arrive, and the first couple that have been voted up are quite technical and in Jessica's world. So first one, Jessica, is it worth exceeding the LTA as part of an IHT mitigation strategy? And we would caveat at least always with, this isn't advice, right? Or whatever we need to say.
Yeah, absolutely.
To make sure we're safe. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I always think the LTA is a little bit odd with some of these sort of areas when we're thinking about them, because I think a lot of the time we still think of it sort of more as a limit than an allowance. So, of course, if you were looking at your pension and you were approaching or thought you would approach the LTA in the future, you might be thinking about looking at other tax wrappers, looking at where it would be best to put additional funding. But I'd say even if you took IHT planning out of the equation, it's not always a terrible idea to exceed your LTA or even plan to exceed the LTA if you need a larger retirement fund, or perhaps if the contributions are coming from an employer where you wouldn't get an alternative benefit if you turn them down. So I think we are still in the realms of sort of thinking of the LTA quite as a ceiling rather than an allowance to work into wider planning. I think from the IHT mitigation point of view, then it's probably a little bit of a red herring, because I think it probably comes back to the point I sort of touched on before, where if the only reason that you're putting that money into the pension is for the IHT planning point of view, you might be in slightly sticky ground anyway. I said, if it does turn out that the rules change before you get there, or if you are looking at it from the point of view of actually putting an enormous sort of anomalous amount into the pension that could be caught out by sort of general anti-abuse rules and seen as avoidance anyway. So I'd probably say if you're looking to fund the pension, you do genuinely need that larger fund, or if it's part of a wider planning piece where you are looking at the LTA as an allowance and a factor within that, then, and the IHT is a factor within that, then it's not a terrible idea to go over it. And he said, of course, it's another one where it will depend on the client and the situation and the other tax wrappers they can use, all of those normal considerations. But yeah, so I think if it's purely a case of saying, shall I go up to and over and put money that I wouldn't otherwise put into a pension purely from IHT planning, it's probably getting into a little bit sticky area within the rules and the intention of the rules anyway.
Excellent, thanks very much. So that question was from James Martin, no relation I don't think, but you never really know, do you? Hopefully that answers the question. James, if you've got a subsequent follow-up, then please ask it at the bottom as well. Okay, so a question from Nigel Hatt. What will happen if a proposed beneficiary is resident overseas, but the SIP provider will not set up an FAD beneficiary account offshore?
Right, so I think there's probably a couple of possibilities depending on why they won't, or whether it's a won't or a can't. So if it is one of these cases where actually the provider's normal rules, normal restrictions would say they don't set up pensions for an overseas client, but they could technically do it, you might be able to come to an agreement with them where they will put it into beneficiaries drawdown on the understanding that it then transfers straight away. Because the issue is that if you've got the pension there where the client has passed away, that provider has to settle the death benefits. So you can't transfer that pension as itself to another provider who can set up beneficiaries drawdown for an overseas beneficiary. That provider has to do it. So they either have to pay out that lump sum or they have to put it into drawdown or potentially an annuity or scheme pension, but set those aside for the sake of this question. So that provider does have to do it. So you said if it is a case that it's their normal rule, but they're willing to, you said, just do it on the system on the understanding that it transfers straight out to someone who is then happy to deal with that in beneficiaries drawdown, that could be an option. If they literally can't do it, you said whether from refusal or because of a system restriction that won't allow them, then that is the territory where that beneficiary would be stuck with a lump sum because that provider has got to settle the death benefits.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for that. Okay, and the next question. So can growing number of clients aged over 75 contribute to a pension to get funds out of their estate? Yeah, so another one.
I think that's me again.
Yeah.
So in a literal sense, yes. So the pension rules stop tax relief on personal and third party contributions from age 75, but you can technically still contribute, and employer contributions are still allowed as well, and they would still be subject to the annual allowance as normal. I think that's always worth just noting. It's more often a scheme's rules that don't permit contributions post 75, whether that's a sort of hangover from when you had to take benefits by 75, or whether again it's the scheme's own choice because they don't do the difference between the tax relievable and non-tax relievable contributions. So yes, technically it is possible, but as we said, again, if over 75s are looking at that purely for an IHT point of view, that's where it's on slightly shaky ground. You know, we know that the government back in 2015 was sort of on record as saying they didn't want pensions to become purely IHT planning vehicles when these death benefits rules opened up. They said it could potentially be caught under something like the general anti-abuse rule, or if it did become something very widespread where lots of over 75s were starting to contribute again purely from that point of view, I think that's the type of thing that could trigger a further rule change, because it's not primarily what the pension's supposed to be for. You said there's that difference between having what's already left there naturally from your pension planning and passing that on tax efficiently and using it purely for that purpose.
Sure. Thanks very much. I'm going to jump down one, and I think Tim and Dan, you're probably going to have a view on this one, and it's something I've been thinking about as well. particularly from a charging perspective. So maybe I'll ask the question as it's written, and then we'll do a follow-up on that one as well. So how do you take on the next generation of clients now who don't have much savings, but will inherit this 1 trillion being passed down? So what is that? What does that kind of now look like in advance of that? Because obviously nobody can predict when that wealth is transferred, so there could be quite an indeterminate amount of time between now and when that wealth is transferred. Tim, do you want to go first? And I think that Danny will probably have a view on this as well.
Sure. Yeah, happy to go first. So yeah, it's a great question. Really, really important question. For me, you're only going to be able to take those clients on if they want to be taken on. And that means you have to be matching their expectations. So as I say, that means you have to be changing your proposition now so that it is suitable in some way for those clients of the future. You know, if you're not doing things like getting some form of technology in place, it doesn't have to be all singing, all dancing, but if you don't have the basics that kind of client would expect, then they're not going to be very happy becoming your clients. But you know, clearly technology is only one part of it. I think it's a really important part, but it is only one part. So in terms of, you know, trying to take those clients on, a lot of it comes down to things like relationship building. You know, can you be building relationships with those inheritance clients? You know, whether it's via their parents, whether you can maybe do some, you know, marketing to those clients, maybe creating seminars for that kind of client. You know, a big part of it, I think, is financial education. So maybe you can run seminars on, I don't know, how to buy a house. You know, a house tends to be the first big purchase that kind of client of that age will make. So if you can be helping with that and becoming a trusted advisor really early on in that relationship, they're more likely to want to come back to you later down the line. But yeah, it's not an easy thing. It does require changes to your business and the way that you've operated, but it's absolutely possible.
Thanks, Tim. Dan.
I think that they're the really key points, and it's about relationship building. I suppose a practical example: if you work with a client who's an asset holder, and you understand that there's a pool of assets that will be handed over to some named beneficiaries, it's that point at which you can engage with the current owner of the assets and say, look, do we need to start bringing in the beneficiaries into this and make them involved in this process? The benefits of that are that, you know, let's say it's from a mother to children, you're going to start helping educate them and make them become financially literate, exactly as you're saying. And, you know, there's benefit to just starting that process already. But what you can also start doing is start having those conversations that you know are relevant to them. So, you know, from my perspective, it's really important for you to ask, in my experience, to ask how they see how that next generation, the beneficiaries, want that money invested. And it might actually be that you need to make some changes to the pot of assets that, you know, let's say it's a pool that's not going to be touched and isn't required for income, so on and so forth. That becomes slightly more complicated, but you could actually start putting in place a plan that that recognizes how the beneficiaries want to have their investments invested. And what you need is a really credible way of creating transparency to the existing set of investments. So something we do with lots of advisors is we use our impact reporting databases to dive into the existing sets of investments and the strategies, and then open that up from a sustainability perspective. Look at how the companies that the current investment are invested in are aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Look at the overall emissions of that portfolio. Are they aligned with a 1.5 degree warming scenario? And then start thinking about some of the positive elements of that and drawing out where actually you can bring to life that by investing in you know, there's so many companies. I don't know. There's a business we were looking at recently, Umicore. You can invest in a company, Umicore, who's got some technology that helps recover materials from old large-scale lithium batteries that are used in electric vehicles. And by drawing out those examples and starting to engage on that front, you can help the next gen realize that there's some really interesting investment opportunities and importantly options for them. And it might be that you make that transition to a more sustainable investment approach, or it might just be that becomes an engagement piece. and what you could do is start helping them with ISAs and smaller investments as well as another part of that. But I think a credible solution and being able to provide the data that they need. And if you are invested in tobacco companies, that you've got something to say, okay, well, you are, but we can make a change here, and this will be aligned with your interests. So I think it's a transparency piece and engagement.
I guess, Dan, you as a business are kind of interested in changing the shape of existing portfolios to an extent. So you might have somebody who's been saving and investing for decades, and has been, mainly interested in returns and tax, say, and obviously there's a distinct shift then in terms of those kind of ESG type influences. And I guess there's two ways that might impact from a generational perspective. So is it going to be that the next generation start to put pressure on the holders of the wealth prior to the transfer? Do they become more interested in how their parents or grandparents are managing those assets now and try and exert some pressure? Do the holders of the assets start to ask family and the next generation, this is all going to be yours one day, what do you think? And either way, should advisors really start to get into that intermediate position to start to try to encourage those conversations, I guess?
It's such a good question, and you see, where there's trustee arrangements, and you can see a range of professional advisors that are working with next gen. There's another piece to that, and that is that conflict between the existing wealth holders and the children, and a conflict of, how do we, how can we start doing things differently? And I think the kind of perceived wisdom is that if you think about impact investing, then you're going to be sacrificing returns, and you're going to be giving something up in order to align your investments with your values. But that's really been something that's been disproven. I think there's a role for most financial advisors to help with that process and help educate both sides of the fence, really, and how they can make the changes. There's definitely some room for conflict. I think from my side, I probably see the end result where the agitation's already happened, and then we're brought in as subject matter specialists to actually help with this. So some advisors where this might be slightly out of their comfort zone will bring in either myself or one of my colleagues, and we can help with some of the discussions on the investment front.
Sure. And Tim, I know it's not necessarily a technology perspective, but it's more of a kind of broader wealth advice proposition question. But do you see Progeny moving into that kind of honest broker space and trying to encourage those intergenerational conversations?
Absolutely, yeah. We from my perspective, we have to. In this country, well, probably in every country, but I think particularly in this country, we're terrible at talking about money, aren't we? I know from my own family's perspective, we don't talk about money, and we don't unless we really have to. I'm lucky enough to still have my grandparents. They're in their late 90s. Not done a huge amount of intergenerational planning, and now it's too late, frankly. So if they had a trusted advisor that they trusted enough to facilitate a conversation between them and their inheritors, that could have been so valuable to them. So as advisors, as advisory businesses, we have to develop that emotional intelligence and that trusted relationship to put ourselves in that position where we can facilitate those conversations, because it helps us, from a very selfish perspective. It's really good from a business perspective to do that, but it's also incredibly important for those families. So yeah, absolutely, we need to be that trusted advisor.
Yeah. And then I guess a question to anybody, charges is going to be at the heart of this, right? So how do you make that kind of extended advice into the different levels of the generations work from a commercial perspective? Family offices and the ultra high net worth advisors have been doing it for decades, right? Because you don't need to take many bips on tens or hundreds of millions. But I guess that all my charges are getting paid out of a source. It does mean that everybody who's related to that particular family office is getting that advice, and it's paid for centrally. So I mean, I guess that's the other way of trying to kind of work this through is, or pretty much all of our CRMs, or most of our CRM systems, to be fair, are individual based, and we can kind of link people together loosely into couples or family units. But maybe CRM needs to become more about the family. And therefore, if we can engage with the family and charge the family, it would kind of make all this a bit easier from a commercial perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree that CRM needs to be about the family, because we should be treating these families as not entirely as one unit, but they're very much related. They're very much interlinked, clearly. So you need to be managing that relationship, possibly through multiple different individuals, whether they're the same generation or multiple generations. And the technology should support you in doing that. The other thing that should support you in doing it is the data in general. That's a really key part of the problem for me. Is generally the technology that we use in the industry doesn't make it easy, let's say, to get the right data in place and take action on that data. But yeah, in terms of the way that you charge, I think first off you've got to have a proposition that's profitable in the first place. Big part of that can be technology driving efficiency, reducing manual workload. That helps you to build that profitable proposition. And then as for when it comes to engaging the next generation, you have to start thinking about different models. If you're just going to charge on a percentage of assets, that's probably not going to work. We've taken on some clients recently. Their assets are negative. They don't have anything to invest yet, but that doesn't mean they don't need advice. They probably need advice more than the older clients, because they're trying to build up that wealth, and they're probably happy to pay for that advice. So you start thinking about things like fixed fee. We could probably do a whole hour on fixed fee, so let's not go there. But it's certainly worth considering how you're maybe changing your model as a whole.
I might add something else, and it's
Sure.
It's about protecting your revenues as a business as well. So there are a lot of campaigns out there at the moment. Make My Money Matter is a great example, and they've got a lot of celebrities on board. There's some great content they're creating, which is on YouTube and across all the platforms, and really trying to get people to engage. And it definitely resonates with the younger generations as well as the older, with their investments, and think about what they're actually invested in. And I think that there's a danger that if you just stick to looking after the current asset owners and don't start asking them the questions and their children, that the younger generation might start agitating and feeding the messages through to your client, and start showing them, look, why hasn't your advisor asked you about this? Look, what are we actually invested in? Why don't you know this? And there's a risk to your existing revenue by not taking action on this front, I would suggest. And those campaigns are becoming they're well funded, they're very broad based, and they're really compelling as well.
Yeah, no, really good. And even simple things, like annual gift allowances. If you've got somebody who's doing active planning for IHT and trying to legitimately get money out of their estate, that's an investment opportunity for the next generation every year. So it's an opportunity to have those discussions around what, how, for how long. You're looking to then become a saver or a reinvestor of that wealth. Excellent. Just going to go back to the questions. Tim, another kind of techie one for you. How can a small firm with a limited budget create a technology-led proposition for the next generation? Can it be done on the cheap?
Can it be done on the cheap? What's that triangle? You can have something cheap or good or fast, and pick one or maybe two.
Yeah. Buy cheap, buy twice, I think is the other one, isn't it?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, absolutely. But no, in fairness, clearly it's easier if you've got a lot of money to throw at it. I won't deny that. But there are absolutely ways that this can be done more cheaply. You do not need a team of 15 in-house developers to build out a technology proposition that next-gen clients will at least find attractive, at least find meets their baseline requirements, and maybe goes some way beyond that. What I would say is focus on what you can control. So that's things, again, going back to data, focus on making sure your data is accurate, it's accessible, you're using the right systems for it. And then look to to buy rather than build. If you're going to build it yourself, it's going to take probably millions. But there are some great off-the-shelf products that you can be using to piece together what becomes a pretty decent technology proposition for clients. Portals, for example. There are plenty of portals out there. Hopefully, most advisory firms are already using them, but they will go a huge way to meeting those clients' expectations. I think, small steps lead to really, really significant improvements, but take it over time. I suppose invest in the business. That's the key thing. If you don't invest in the business in the next generation now, then it's not going to work. Your business won't be here for decades to serve them. So it does take some investment.
Yeah.
I just quickly on the point, something that's very it's interesting you say about the portal. So something that we've developed is a portal that actually is a really key, I guess, it's a key selling point for some of the propositions that we offer, and it's that in its own right is incredibly valuable, and it actually helps advisors win business. So I very much second that.
Excellent. I'm going to skip the next one just for a moment and just wanted to ask Jessica about this Staveley ruling. So do you think the Staveley ruling will set a precedent for future cases? You kind of did allude to that, but you weren't overly confident. If people are trying to go too far over the line, I guess they could well fall foul.
Yeah, I think there are a few issues that make it a bit uncertain with the Staveley case. So firstly, it was so closely tied to the minute details of that specific situation that you do think no other case is going to come up that was identical to that one, and it's like, how do you pick apart what was related? Is it so closely to that situation and apply it to another one? As you said, the decision changed at each point, which never helps because you could pick out different parts from different parts of the ruling. And of course, even though it only got resolved last year, it was a pre-A-Day case effectively. So it was from an old Section 32 to a personal pension just after A-Day, whereas I think most cases that come through now, or if advisors are thinking about current clients, it's probably going to be DC to DC, or at least not a case where the death benefits in the original pension had to go to the estate. That said, I do think that there was a very key point or a very interesting point from that Supreme Court ruling that could be taken away. So a critical question in the whole case was, did Mrs. Staveley intend to confer benefits on her sons, her beneficiaries? And most of the earlier rulings all said, yes, the sons had a benefit conferred on them. And the argument was around whether Mrs. Staveley intended that to be the case. So they said they definitely had benefits conferred, but did she intend it or not? And that went back and forward. In the Supreme Court ruling, they almost took a step back and actually questioned the idea about whether the sons did have benefits conferred on them. Because they pointed out that actually they didn't actually have any rights under the old or the new pension scheme. In either case, Mrs. Staveley could have changed her will, could have changed the expression of wishes, the provider could have done something different. So the Supreme Court actually sort of said the sons didn't have a right conferred on them. And therefore, if there were no benefits conferred, there was no loss to the estate, there couldn't possibly be a transfer of value. It doesn't matter what the intention was. And I think that might be the key point that we start seeing in other cases, because the arguments from the Supreme Court about why they said a benefit hadn't been conferred, I think could apply to most current situations. This idea that actually the beneficiaries don't have a right. They've been nominated to possibly receive something, but they don't have any rights. So if that's the thing that's picked up, I think that could apply to more contemporary cases as in the same way that it did for the Staveley. So I think that might be one of the key points to watch out for.
But we probably want to see, we're going to see another couple of test cases at some point, I guess, is, watch the space then, isn't it? And see
pretty much.
Yeah. Just whether people are brave enough to be the test cases themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Probably intentionally.
Question from Adrian. I'm tempted to invite Adrian onto screen to answer his own question, but I won't do that. And I'm not sure who they're directed to, so if anybody wants to put their hands up, that'd be great. With inflation now rising rapidly, what impact might that have on the plans of clients seeking to make intergenerational wealth transfers? I think, Daniel, I'm probably going to come to you first.
Yeah, so there's definitely a short-term inflationary impulse, and the big question out there on everyone's minds is, well, I suppose not everyone, but a lot of people's minds is, will that stick around at an elevated level for longer? You know, we're certainly not thinking about 70s style inflation, but it's higher than it has been for a long time. How does that affect that planning? I've met investors who have been so disengaged with investment. Again, I'm coming at this from a sustainability perspective, and investors who have just sat on cash inside their pensions because they're just not comfortable and they've not found a way of investing that actually meets their requirements. So, you know, being able to offer an investment solution, of course, being involved in being invested in the equity market is really important when you've got higher levels of inflation. So that's sort of one angle, finding options that are right for your clients and helping them avoid having their wealth eroded by cash values. I think it might be a helpful way to engage with some of the younger generations, because while they might not have a lot of financial assets, and some of the assets that they do have might be directed towards a property purchase, in which case it's not necessarily suitable to have them invested, they'll certainly be feeling the pinch from rising inflation. So, you know, when you're having that conversation with the family, you can say, look, how do you protect yourself longer term against inflation? It's about ensuring that you're taking enough risk with your investments and you're making good long-term decisions to protect the real value of your assets. And, you know, that might be helping them with their pension scheme at work, or it might be saying, okay, well, you know, you've got your cash for your deposit, but actually maybe start putting some more away and investing that in the stock market. So it's very relevant, and I think it opens up quite a few discussion points.
Yeah, no, that's good. And James Martin made a point at the bottom of Adrian's question. Actually, it was saying, is inflation rising rapidly over the long term, or are we just talking about short-term inflation? And as you started your answer, that is the big question, I guess, and where we go from here will depend on how things shape up over the next 6 to 12 months. Thanks for that. So we're pretty much out of time. I'm going to ask one more, because it's specifically about EQ, Daniel. It seems rude body wrong not to ask that question. Have you seen demographic changes or differences amongst your clients at EQ? And is it something you track, measure? Do you have some metrics around it?
Yeah, well, yeah, definitely. It's a really interesting question. I think it has a lot of, you know, the age of your client base and the sort of demographics, you know, ultimately for a lot of advisors is very important because it affects the value of their business. We do track those metrics, although they primarily go into our impact reporting. So we've got our 2021 impact reports out soon. So we've crunched those numbers recently, and actually there's a difference between impact investors and those who are sustainably minded. So impact is where you're really engaged and you want to create change with your investments, and the age of that investor is substantially younger and is substantially more biased towards female investors, which I thought, which is quite interesting. So I think that our overall age range relative to most would be much younger and probably a lot more biased towards women. I think we have about 52-48 for female male investors. So there's definitely a difference there, and of course everything we're doing is sustainable. So I suspect that would look quite different to many others out there.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks for that. That put us at time. Thank you ever so much to the three of you for attending and giving us some really good answers to questions. It's been a really good session. I've enjoyed it. Thanks for everybody else attending. As Alex just put in the chat, the next webinar is on Thursday, 28th of October. And that's AI strategy at the heart of digital transformation. So kind of nice segue on from this one to look at how that kind of whole AI, big data, robotics feeds into this kind of and the advice gap and other forms of advice as well. So thanks for coming. See you on the next one. Cheers now.
Thank you.
Bye everybody.